We now welcome back to the show a man who has worked tirelessly and passionately to raise awareness globally of the potential for a solar event in the near future that could dramatically impact our current grid, or what our current grid currently is as it is being used today. One that is full of weaknesses, vulnerabilities, not to mention, the vulnerability to an EMP from a foreign government during a time of war. Instead of sending people into fear or into a panic, and before our guest even wrote his viral article entitled 400 Chernobyls, Solar Flares, EMP, and Nuclear Armageddon, our guest was already on the path towards solutions with several very detailed books entitled When Technology Fails, which is a great book, one I have in storage, and another, When Disaster Strikes, both available at his website, whentechfails.com. We are honored to again have Matthew Stein on Outside the Box, who is also a design engineer, a green builder, and MIT graduate. But most important of all, Matthew Stein is a regular guest on both the mainstream media and the alternative media, spreading this very important truth with the eyes to see and ears to hear. Matthew Stein, thank you for being with us today.
Thanks a lot, Alex. Pleasure to be back on the show again. Good to chat with you. Been a while.
For those that don't know, your wife passed away several years ago, and you've been in this cycle, this period of mourning and recovery, and also getting very active. I see you've done a lot of interviews in the last few months, in the last year alone. So How have things been?
Well, she passed away a year ago Christmas, so it's been just a year and a few months, and I'm popping back really well. I've been doing shows again. I'm writing, working. I've got 4 new books laid out. But it was a really rough year and a half as she dealt with her illness. It took us about 6 months to figure out what it was, and so that was a pretty rough ride. And then I was pretty devastated for at least a month afterwards. Then my sister had invited me to Yellowstone while my wife was still alive, and I said, I can't possibly go. And then she was celebrating her 60th birthday with a backcountry guided tour through Yellowstone with friends and family. And so when I said, my wife's not going to make it, it would probably do me a world of good to get out of my house and be out in nature. And that really was a huge turning point for me, to spend a week out in nature with the buffalo and the elk and the moose and the geese and swans and pine martens and all kinds of amazing wildlife and scenery in Yellowstone. It just really helped me function again and get back on my feet and start, smiling again.
I think that's why I went to Colorado a couple of years ago to get that reset and, immerse myself in nature. And you were thinking about making a move potentially to the Pacific Northwest. Are you still thinking about the Oregon area?
I haven't really been thinking about that. My son lives up in the Oregon area, and he sort of invited me to come up there. But I'm staying put here for the time being. Eventually, I'd like to be in a place that grows food better than Truckee. But who knows, with climate change, maybe this will be the place to grow food. It's not the best soil, that's for sure. And we typically in the past had frost about 11 months of the year and tons of snow. But I don't know; those days may be behind us now.
Yeah, there's definitely a lot of talk about the drought in California, and I don't know if you've heard the population is really growing in Portland and Oregon as a result. I just would probably prefer to be somewhere a little less dense of a population, but, we're going to talk about why that is today. You talk about nuclear Armageddon, 400 Chernobyls, and the majority of the people listening to us may be on the West and East Coast. And, it's funny, maybe not so funny. They just came out with a report, How to Survive the Zombie Apocalypse. And they're basically recommending that. And maybe that could be caused maybe by a solar event where no one's eating and, people are roaming the land looking for food. But they recommended that people not be in the major West Coast cities or East Coast cities, that they try to find we're talking about survivors. They recommend survivors head in the direction of the Rocky Mountains or the Mountain Time Zone. Yeah, well, without getting ahead of ourselves, where would you like to start in discussing this solar flare threat that we face and what we can do about it?
Well, let's talk about the real nuts and bolts about the threat. Like, is it a threat, and how what is the science behind it, and what do they say? Let's just start there, because a lot of people are like, I keep hearing about solar flares and EMPs, but nothing's happened, right? Well, statistically, looking at ice core samplings, extreme solar events happen about once every 75 to 100 years. So this is not something like the asteroid that hit 40 million years ago that just wiped out the dinosaurs. I'm really not worried about a once in 40 million year event. But the simple fact is the last extreme solar event that we had was in 1921, the Great Geomagnetic Storm of 1921. And it lit the sky up from the North Pole to Puerto Rico and Hawaii. And it lit the sky up from the South Pole all the way to American Samoa. So the entire planet was lit up at night, except for a very narrow sliver of the deep tropical zones. Now, when it happened in 1921, it was no big deal. I mean, it burned down a railway station in, 30 miles outside of New York City. It induced enough current that a fire started, burned it down, and it burned down some telegraph stations, and it messed up communications, but it wasn't that big of a deal. But see, since then, we've developed this amazing grid across our country that's interconnected with 100,000 miles of high voltage power lines. And these high voltage power lines act like giant antennas, and these didn't exist in 1921. And not only do they act like giant antennas, at the end of each power line, there's a massive transformer called an extra high voltage transformer that steps the voltage up from up to 350,000 to a million volts, and then at the other end it steps it back down to voltages that can be transformed by the little transformers on the power poles in your neighborhood. And the problem is that these things are really wonderful for transmitting huge amounts of electric power long distances with great efficiency, but they're an Achilles heel, and they're extremely vulnerable to the voltage spikes that happen in a solar storm or an electromagnetic pulse of a nuclear device. So what we've got now is this Achilles heel where it didn't exist the last time one of these storms rolled through. And so we're really not ready for it. Now, I'm hearing some noise. Is everything okay at your end? Are you guys hearing me okay, or are we
that may have been some from AFR. I'm muted, but I think it's working itself out.
Okay. I just wanted to make sure I wasn't talking to nobody here. So the truth of the matter is then that this grid that we developed is much more complex, and it does a lot more great things than the grid did, 100 years ago or 90 years ago, the last time a big storm rolled through. But it's got this Achilles heel, and it's totally vulnerable. Now, there's a good news part of it, and that there's a fix. The bad news is they're not doing it. It's kind of like the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers warned that it wasn't a question of if New Orleans would be flooded and the levees would fail. It was a question of when the next Category 3 storm was going to hit New Orleans and fail. See, we'd already had a big storm. In 1909, they had the storm that killed 12,000 people in Galveston, Texas, and flooded New Orleans. But that's the last time it happened. So we're looking at kind of the same situation here, where the engineers and scientists were saying, we've got a solution to fix this problem in New Orleans. But everyone said, hey, it ain't broke, don't fix it. It hasn't flooded in my memory, not in my lifetime, so why bother? Well, we're in the same boat right now with our grid. We've got these scientists and engineers warning that this isn't a question of if it's going to happen. It's a question of when is it going to happen. It's a question of when do the dice come up snake eyes. It's a question of when does Mother Earth, when does the universe throw a big storm our way, or when does some nasty country get their hands on a nuclear weapon and blow it off in suborbital space above the planet and fry the electronics in our country. Both of them will accomplish. They're similar and related, but not identical. And I'll get into those changes shortly. But first I want to talk about how real this problem is. So the last big storm like this, we've had 100 strong geomagnetic storms in the last 150 years. Only 2 of those were extreme events that would cause this, game over scenario in the United States. And the one, so the last one was 90-something years ago in 1921, and the one before that was only 60 years earlier in 1859, called the Carrington event. That was even 50% stronger than the 1921. So here we have an event that scientists say we have an 8 a 1 in 8 chance every decade of getting hit with one of these killer storms. It's been 9 decades since the last one. So do the math. 1 in 8 chance every decade, and we've gone 9 decades without a major storm. So we're due. We just don't know when it's going to happen. Now, just about a year and a half ago, we had a near miss. The sun had this huge coronal mass ejection. That's when, like, the sun burps, and kind of this big blob of highly charged plasma goes blasting out of the sun at many times faster than what our fastest rockets can fly. It goes flying off through space like 100 times faster than our rockets, and it heads out into space, and most of the time it misses Earth, and on rare occasions, 100 strong ones in the last 150 years, it hits the Earth. Well, every now and then a really big one hits the Earth, and we get a huge event like 1921 or 1859. Well, it turned out that in 2012, we had one of those such events that went right through the Earth's orbit, but if the Earth had been 2 weeks different in its Earth's orbit, in other words, it went right through the Earth orbit and just missed the planet. In other words, if it had happened 2 weeks earlier, it would have been a direct hit and would have been game over for everything as we know it. So we came that close. We were within 2 weeks in our orbit of being total direct hit of that giant CME. So, it's not a question of if, it's a question of when, and I can't answer that. It's not like clockwork. You can't predict like the calendar on the sun. All it is statistics, and statistics says we're overdue. Ice core sampling says we're overdue. Scientists, geophysicists say we're overdue. When's the next one? Nobody can say. So, let's talk about what it means when one of these things hits. And we'll focus on the sun now, and then after the next break, which I think is coming up soon, then I'll focus on an EMP and what the difference is between the sun, solar storm, and an EMP. So when the solar storm happens, most of your personal electronics is probably going to survive just fine. Your iPhones, your cars, and all of that. Unfortunately, these massive transformers that keep our grid going, you're going to lose. There was a study commissioned by the Department of Homeland Security in Oak Ridge National Labs a few years back, a Meditech study, where they'd done the EMP commission, the bipartisan congressional EMP commission, looked at this and said, hey, this is a serious problem. So they commissioned the Meditech Corporation to do a computer modeling of the grid and to look at what we could figure out from physicists of the strength of the 1921 storm. And so they based all of their analysis on the strength of the 1921 storm. And they looked at the American grid, North American grid, and the models indicated that 365 of these big transformers would blow. And you might say, well, no, so what if a transformer blows, right? They got a bunch of these in stock, right? And they go down to the hardware store and they buy a transformer. It's like, no, these transformers are hundreds of tons each. They're tens of millions of dollars a piece. Each one is custom designed and custom made per installation. And currently there's a 3-year waiting list to buy one transformer because China and India have been ramping up their grid growth so fast. It's a 3-year waiting list. Now, in 2006, there was one of these strong solar storms that was less than a tenth as strong as the 1921 one, which is 50% weaker than the 1859 one. And that one was a longer duration than the 1989 storm, which was pretty strong, also a 10% as strong as the 1921 one. But that one wiped out 14 of these big transformers in South Africa. And so that gives us a pretty good idea of what's going to go on, but way worse. So what happened to South Africa? Well, 14 of these transformers failed within the next month or two. Now, some of them failed right away. Some of them failed over a couple months because this power surge caused the windings to burn their insulation, and they eventually failed, 14. It took them a year to rush an order in from all over the world to replace those 14 transformers. So the way South Africa survived for a year was they had rolling blackouts the entire country. Imagine going to work in 2 or 3 days out of your work week. You go to work and there's no power for 6 hours in the workday. There's no lights, there's no air conditioning, there's no elevators, there's no refrigeration, nothing. And every single backup generator in that country was scarfed up in the first 2 hours after that blew.
Okay, that's the sound of the music. We'll be back with Matthew Stein from wintechfails.com. We'll be back. What will you do when technology fails? It's a question that we're asking ourselves today with Matthew Stein. And actually, recently in Portland, Oregon, there was a power outage, and what we saw were a number of homes completely blacked out, without lights, without candles, and certainly without a doubt, one of the things that they were missing was any form of illumination. And so hopefully people are actually taking a look at these things when they lose power, and they're doing inventory of what they have, what they don't have. So our guest today, Matthew Stein, is probably one of the most active guests out there, not only the mainstream media, but alternative media, discussing solar storms, EMP threats, and how do we best prepare without getting caught up in the fear, the doom and gloom, et cetera, et cetera. Okay, and we are back on AmericanFreedomRadio.com. Harnessing the power of the sun, the power of this radio show, working out a few technical kinks, and all the interviews will be posted at youtube.com/AlexAnsary. One short story that I'm going to share is that, and then we'll go back to Matthew. I work for a guy in Texas that ran his own electric company, and he thought it was really weird to talk about transformers and the time that it takes for them to be created, manufactured, and shipped. He was of the attitude that you can just walk out in the middle of anywhere, stick your finger in the ground, as he kind of put it, and get electricity. Sometimes I think people don't want to hear the truth, Matthew, because they have almost a religious-like zeal towards expecting the world to be the same way that it's always been, to not have any interruptions. And I don't know, maybe their ego's threatened. I'm really trying to understand psychologically, Matthew, what the block is. But what do you think the block is?
I think it's just denial. It's the belief that, our scientists and engineers are so smart that they can, of course they'll take care of this, and of course somebody's going to make sure this is okay. And, that's the general population's attitude. In fact, it's that same attitude within our government that is leading to our vulnerability. And let me explain that. See, in the around 2005 to 2007 or 8, 10, they had this bipartisan EMP commission, Electromagnetic Pulse Commission, that was formed, and the person who was in charge of the commission, I like to call him Dr. Billy Graham, but his name is actually Dr. William Graham, and he's not the same as the Billy Graham that we're aware of. And he was Ronald Reagan's chief science advisor for 3 years, and he was a key player in the DoD's nuclear program for about 30 years, and so he's a nuclear scientist and an engineer, and he's not exactly like a left-wing radical kind of guy. And about the same time as me, he came to the same conclusion totally independently. And in October of 2011, after Fukushima had happened in that spring, in October of 2011, he wrote a letter to President Obama and Stephen Chu, who was his chief science advisor at the time, and a number of people in both Republicans and Democrats in the House and in the Senate. And he warned, and he said, in fact, let me just quote it. I've got the letter right here. So let me see if I can dig it out real quick. I might. Yeah. Let's see. Yeah, I've got it somewhere in my file, so I'll probably dig it out in a few minutes. Anyway, he basically said that we're facing multiple Fukushima-like events if we do not do something to harden our grid infrastructure and protect it from both EMPs and solar storms. and that it was a guaranteed thing to happen, not an if it will happen, but a when will it happen. And he said, we've really got to do something. This is a real problem. Now, the way I came to this conclusion is probably pretty close to the way he did. When I was writing my second book, When Disaster Strikes, a manual, basically it's a prepping and survival guide. And I just finished the draft for the next to the last chapter on EMP and solar storms 2 weeks before Fukushima. And then 3 days before Fukushima, I finished the draft for the last chapter, which was the unthinkable surviving a nuclear catastrophe. So then Fukushima happens, and I'm doing about 25 radio shows, and some caller calls in, and I talked about how the failure mode in Fukushima was not direct failure due to the earthquake, but indirect failure when the tsunami came along. A nuclear power plant is designed to put out tons and tons, megawatts of power, tons of power, very high rates of power out of a nuclear power plant. And when the grid goes down, it has no place to put that power. So it has to shut itself off immediately, goes into immediate emergency shutdown mode anytime there's a grid down situation locally, because it can't just create this power with no place to go. So when it does that, then these giant pumps kick in, and they put tons of cooling water through the core of the reactor to take that heat away. Because normally that water's going through the core and it's running steam turbines, but now they just have to suck the heat out, or the reactor will overheat and blow up. And so in Fukushima, when the grid went down instantly with their 8.9 earthquake, then the reactor did what it was supposed to do. The backup generators kicked in, the pumps kicked in, they started pumping tons of water through the core to keep it cooled down. And then 20 minutes later, the tsunami came along, and it wiped out 5 of the 6 banks of pumps and backup generators that were keeping those cooled. So there were 6 nuclear reactors at Fukushima, only 4 of which were going at the same time. So there was 2 that were down for refueling, thank God, and there was 4 more going fully. Well, number 6 was the only one that had a functioning cooling system and a functioning backup generators. So the crew, luckily it was during the day when it happened, or there would have been more than a dozen Fukushimas around Japan if it had happened at nighttime. But because it happened during the day when they had full staffs of people to jump into emergency mode and keep things from melting down, you only had 2 reactors with a full meltdown and 1 with a partial meltdown in Fukushima. And it would have been more like 10 to 15 reactors in the country of Japan that would have gone down, because they had similar cooling system failures, but not quite as bad at other places. They were able to do, with all the massive numbers of people on site during the day, they were able to do the emergency, whatever they had to do to keep them from melting down. So that's the story that people didn't know, is that they were 6 hours from losing all of Japan. In other words, if that earthquake had happened 6 hours earlier in the middle of the night, we would have lost Japan. It would have been over for the entire country right then and there. And, I mean, they were that close. It was just a matter of a few hours difference, whether they lost the country or just lost a province. And so, that's what we're looking at. So anyway, the tsunami came along. They were able to shunt power from number 6 to number 5 to keep it to only partially melt down, like 3 Mile Island did. But reactors, the other 2 reactors, they just totally melted down. They were over. So what happened then is these things are designed with massive containment vessels, with 6 feet thick concrete and steel containment vessel, designed to try and keep all the nasty stuff inside in the event of a meltdown or failure. Well, it's not like us engineers can go out and study nuclear failures. I mean, these things were supposed to be like a 1 in a trillion failure chance, and they were supposed to be designed with tons of overkill to make sure that, it would be like 1,000 years before we had a nuclear failure. Well, we've now had 5 nuclear failures in the last 40 years. We've had 3 Mile Island, we've had Chernobyl, and we had 3 Fukushima reactors fail. So we've had 5 meltdown reactors. It's something that was supposed to be 1 in a 1,000-year event. We've had 5 in 40 years. Somehow I think they kind of missed it on their calculations. Somehow, in spite of their best shot at being like super safe, They just didn't have a class in studying reactor failures, and they gave it their best shot, but they obviously didn't do well enough. So anyway, what happened then is when the pump stopped pumping water, 15 minutes later, the water in the reactor superheated into superheated steam, and it caused enough pressure that it fractured the containment vessel. And we saw that on TV when you saw these big clouds of steam. Well, then what happened was something that none of those engineers had planned for. The containment vessel blew, the core was uncooled, and so each of these reactor rods, the uranium rods, they superheated, and these rods, these fuel rods, are encased in a material called zirconium, because plain old steel gets too much high embrittlement from the radiation and falls apart. So these reactor fuel rods are encased in a material called zirconium. Now, zirconium, when it gets superheated, what happens is it burns like magnesium. Like, I don't know, did you take chemistry in high school? You know, and most little kids like me were all pyromaniacs. I mean, I always tried to get my hands on anything explosive or that would burn really high, like gunpowder and stuff like that. I was a little kind of boy genius chemistry pyromaniac kind of guy. And there was nothing like burning magnesium foil. You know, you burn that stuff and you have to wear sunglasses, glacier glasses, or shield your eyes, because it burned so bright it would burn the corneas, it would burn your eyes if it burned so bright. Well, these fuel rods, the zirconium, burns just like magnesium. So when the reactor loses all of its cooling water and blows its top, and the zirconium rods start connecting with each other and overheating, and they start burning, you start actually getting a fire. That's one of the reasons that they were like spraying all of that seawater at Chernobyl, was they were trying to keep those rods cool enough so they wouldn't burn, because when they burn, they start having a fire, just like happened at Chernobyl. The only way they put out that fire at Chernobyl, the graphite fuel fire, graphite and uranium fuel fire, was they had suicide missions where guys got in helicopters, knowingly giving their lives for Mother Russia, and flying over the burning reactor at Chernobyl and dumping tons and tons of concrete and earth and rock on top of that reactor. So they buried it with concrete and earth and rock, and then they did a concrete sarcophagus around it. But there was a couple hundred guys who basically gave their lives right off the bat and died, really ugly deaths, or some of them lived, but lived very sickly lives until most of them died of cancer, or they get Chernobyl AIDS. So it turns out the aftermath of Chernobyl, you hear, only a few hundred died right away, and then 1,000 or so died. That's the official numbers. But then the Russian Epistemological Science Society did a study of all of the areas, and they compared death rates from cancers before and after Chernobyl in the downwind areas. And they found that 1 million people have died, early deaths, as a result of radiation poisoning from Chernobyl. And all around Chernobyl, the Chernobyl necklace is common. You go in any of those villages in the Ukraine and downwind, and Chernobyl necklace is the words that they use to describe the big thyroid tumors people see around their necks, and deformed children. And Chernobyl AIDS. Chernobyl AIDS is the description for the crippling immune system disease that the downwind people got, where they're basically sickly and have a compromised immune system and live really, really terrible quality lives like someone dying of AIDS, until they eventually die of one disease or another, or an early death. So it's pretty dismal, and like I said, 1 million people have died as a result of Chernobyl, and that's one major nuclear accident. Now, there's 440 approximately nuclear power plants in the world, and there's something like 104 functioning plants in the United States. So they shut down, San Onofre, so maybe it's down to 102 now. But we're looking at over 37% of the population of the United States lives within 50 miles of a nuclear power plant. So we're looking at a situation where, in a long-term grid-down scenario, like an EMP or a solar storm, you're looking at a high probability that the country will be messed up for months to years, and the Nuclear Regulatory Commission mandates that every nuclear power plant has a week of backup fuel on hand. The problem is that in total chaos situation where the grid's down. Think of this grid down. There's no internet. There's no telephone. There's no pumps working to pump gasoline at a gas station. There's no elevators. There's no air conditioning. There's no refrigeration systems. There's no water treatment. Where does a city of 10 million people pee and poo when there's no power?
And we'll pick that up on the other side, as well as which cities you recommend people not be in for this event and which places might be more desirable to reside in. Matthew Stein is our guest from wintechfails.com. Stay right there. We'll be back with much more information coming ahead. We'll be back. Solar storms, EMPs, and the most mindful way to prepare. That's our topic today with our guest, Matthew Stein of wintechfails.com. Okay, so one thing I also want to mention, I'm seeing an abundance of stories coming out about U.S. military satellites either ceasing to function or, if not ceasing to function, something else happening to where, they have to be repaired or they end up as space junk. And perhaps there's something going on with China attacking some of these satellites. It could really be a mix of the both. I just want to share with Matthew that I'm hearing more of these stories in the news, but there isn't always an official reason as to what happened. So there's certainly this aspect of secrecy involved in these stories as to what's really causing these military satellites to fail.
Yeah, I mean, it's not really my area of expertise, but and so I kind of listen, but things like that, unless I have an inside person to really fill me in, I just kind of sort of listen and look, but I can't offer much of an opinion on it because I don't have the insider information. Now I'm doing a symposium on EMP in Delta, Utah this Saturday, and I'm going to be co-presenting with a general who's active in Impact America. And so it'll be really interesting to rub elbows with this general on all day Saturday and pick his brain and get some more insider information that I haven't been privy to in the past. So, I mean, he can't give me real classified information, but, it'll be, he's certainly a lot closer to the fire than I am.
Right. Well, I just want to get your take on that and also share that with you because if you type in U.S. military satellites failing, those stories seem to be exploding on Google. At least every year I'm seeing more of them. So where would you like to continue?
Okay. First thing I just want to mention real briefly then how you can Google map in nuclear power plants and see where the nearest ones are to your house and think about that. Now, I'm hoping, because there is a fix to this problem, I'm hoping that they're going to fix it. But I've seen how poorly they dealt with the warnings about the levees that were going to fail with the next Category 3 or stronger storm hitting New Orleans. And I'll talk in a minute, in a little while, I want to talk about what the government is doing and why they're stalled on this issue. And and basically it's kind of what you said, where one person tells them what they want to hear, that everything's going to be okay, we got it covered, and somebody else tells them that no, it's a real problem. And the natural tendency is to want to believe the guy that tells you what you want to hear, that you can sleep at night and that we're covered and everything's going to be okay. And I believe in Santa Claus and the Tooth Fairy and the Easter Bunny too, because that's what I want to hear. Anyway, so let's talk about. We've talked about the problem with EMPs and these failing long-term grid down failures, and the fact that 365 of these transformers in North America alone in the United States, are projected to fail. Roughly, and I talked to John Kappenman, who was the lead guy in the Meditech report, the lead researcher and the guy in charge of authoring the report. And I said, well, how many do you think worldwide? What do you think? And he said, well, I didn't study it. I said, what do you think, 2,000? He said, yeah, that's probably a good number. Well, they can make, right now, the world's manufacturing capacity for these transformers is about 100 a year, maybe 200 max. So if 2,000 of these blow in a single solar storm lasting anywhere from a day to a week, you're talking like 10 to 20 years of manufacturing capacity in the world to replace them. And most of the places in the world that make these things will be crippled by the solar storm just as badly as we will. So you're looking at a situation where the rest of the world will be relying on places like India and the Philippines and perhaps Brazil, and they do make these transformers in Brazil now, but in the first year of making these transformers, they had a 50% failure rate because there's a real science and art to making them. And all the guys who used to make them in the United States, last time they made them in the United States was like 15 years ago. So the guys who used to make them here, they've all retired or died. So we don't really know how to make them here anymore because we upgraded our grid from 1970 to 2000 to these extra high voltage transformers, and then there was no market. Because, someone in the third world is not going to pay American prices to buy transformers. So they'll buy a transformer from India or Brazil or wherever, someplace making them cheaper than here. So anyway, we're looking at a situation where if the power goes down between a week and a month. Now, some of these nuclear reactor guys called me up and said, hey, even though the NRC mandates that we stock 1 week's of fuel on hand, we got a month of fuel at our reactor. We're not that stupid. We're going to keep a month on hand. So you got a month on hand. Well, it took a year for South Africa to get 14 transformers rushed from all over the world to replace their 14 blows transformers. What are we going to do? How long is it going to take us to get 365 transformers and the world to get 2,000 transformers? If there's 2,000 blown transformers at once in the world, where are they going to come from? Especially when most of the places that make them will be down too. I mean, you're talking a really serious situation. And so with that time down, who's going to guarantee that diesel fuel trucks are going to show up like clockwork at America's 100 nuclear power plants and keep them going when the rest of the country is dying and people, diesel trucks are magically going to roll down the freeway and nobody's going to hijack them and the Army's going to make sure they get to all of our nuclear power plants and keep them going when there's mass chaos everywhere? I talked to the first responders, did a big EMP tabletop exercise about a year ago. And they all got in there, and they were blown away. They basically said, wow, this is so bad. They said, we're just going to go home and fend for our families and protect our families. I mean, what else can we do in this situation? I mean, nobody's going to be functioning. The military's not going to be functioning. The government's not going to be functioning. Sure, they've got backup power generators for the military to move around, and they've got National Guard. But you saw how strung out they were dealing with New Orleans. Now imagine 50 Hurricane Katrinas happening at once around the country. I mean, there's even the military, they're going to be totally overloaded and overwhelmed. And chances are that we're going to see Fukushima-like events happening unless they get their act together and they do the proactive, let's plan for this event, let's put the protective measures in place, let's get EMP-hardened containers with backup generators at each and every nuclear facility, let's mandate a year's worth of fuel at each facility, and for an extra $1 billion or $2 billion, we can install this new technology that will protect these high-voltage transformers in the event of an EMP or solar storm and shunt those power surges to Earth and protect those transformers. So for the price of a single stealth bomber, a single B-2 bomber, we got like 22 of those bombers. And for a price of one of those bombers, a tiny fraction of what we bailed Wall Street out, we can prevent Armageddon from happening. And this Armageddon is going to happen.
Quick question, Matthew.
It's a solar storm.
Quick question out of curiosity, and I'm not asking you to speculate, but is it physically possible to say if someone had an underground facility, for example, that wasn't public, is it physically possible to have a way to shield military technology, perhaps planes, perhaps other things, regardless of whether or not they're saying that they're doing it? Is it physically possible in today's day and age to shield military technology somewhere in the ground?
Oh, you can shield technology above ground and underground. I mean, there is a report. There's a link if you go to my 400 Chernobyls article at whentechfails.com, it's got all of the hot links for the article. I mean, I printed out a stack of documents about 14 inches tall when I was writing 400 Chernobyls. And when I started researching this, I planned on spending like a week or two on this article. I spent 6 weeks with no pay writing this article. I mean, I got a couple $100 out out of Nexus magazine, who published it, and it got published at a bunch of places for free on the internet. But there's hot links, and one of those hot links is a military grounding and bonding for nuclear EMP manual that is, common knowledge in the internet. But it's difficult. The grounding and bonding is difficult to protect for EMP. So unless you're a really electronics tech kind of guy, what you're best off doing if you want to protect your own stuff is to put it in like in a garbage can. Put it in bags, garbage bags, wrap them with aluminum foil or aluminum screening, and then put them in a garbage can or an old refrigerator with the cable cut off. And basically that's called a double Faraday cage. And so shielding from EMP and solar storms is not bad. In fact, you don't really need to shield from solar storms. What you need to do is have backup power like solar panels and wind turbine so that you can provide and your battery backups, even if it's small scale. Like most of us just don't have that much money for a full-scale solar program. But like you were talking about, you have some panels. I have a really nice travel trailer with a 250-watt panel and a 1,500-watt inverter and a couple of golf cart 6-volt, really deep cycle 6-volt batteries. I bought the batteries first from Costco, the deep cycle 12-volt, like you use on your boats, and they just didn't last. They just didn't make it.
We'll talk more about that when we come back with our very special guest, Matthew Stein from windtechfails.com. I'm Alex Ansary, and you're tuned in to Outside the Box on AmericanFreedomRadio.com. Welcome to Hour 2 of Outside the Box Radio. For March 4th, 2015, we are talking with our guest, Matthew Stein, and we are now moving our discussion to preparedness. And by the way, you might want to check out his article in full for more detailed information on what we're looking at with the sun and the EMP. Just type into Google Matthew Stein and 400 Chernobyls, and the article will come up. So, Matthew, what you're saying is solar panels with a deep cycle marine-grade battery and an inverter, that should be safe enough. That should be a form of technology, if you will, that is not as volatile as other things because there's no computer chips involved?
Well, there are chips involved with inverters. So
right.
Let me talk, before we go further into preparedness, let's talk about the difference between EMP and solar storms, because that's something that most people don't really understand. So some people call a solar storm a natural EMP. But you can also refer to as geomagnetic disturbance, GMD, for the solar storm. Now, EMP, electromagnetic pulse, that's something that happens when a nuclear device is blown off in the upper atmosphere. And what that does is that sets off a chain reaction that gives this electromagnetic pulse that comes down around into the affected zone underneath. Now, the EMP gives an E1 and an E2 and an E3 effect. And I'll explain what each one is real briefly. So an E1 effect is something that happens like in a fraction of a fraction of a fraction of a blink of an eye. It's basically a sort of a speed of light effect, and it happens in nanoseconds. And that's like, and the effect is kind of like, imagine on a dry winter's day, having a carpet and rubbing your feet on the carpet and sticking your hand inside your computer case, opening the housing, and sticking your finger in and sparking a bunch of chips and saying, gee, I wonder what that did. It's like chances are you're going to cook your computer. So that's the E1 effect. It's like little electrostatic sparks of high intensity happening like all over electronics, all in the affected zone. The E2 effect is similar to like 50,000, like 10,000 lightning bolts happening every few square miles all over the affected zone. And the problem is that those really cool surge protectors we all got to protect our computers, most of those will have been fried by the E1 effect. So if your computer stuff survived the E1 effect, most of them will cook with the E2 effect, with all these power surges coming down your lines as if there's lightning strikes happening all around you, because your surge protectors will have been cooked by the E1 effect. Then comes along, and that happens in the space of like a few seconds to a couple of minutes, the E2 effect. And then the E3 effect is a long, slow burn. The E3 effect is essentially identical to the solar storm, only over a much smaller area. And so the E3 effect is this long, slow burn that happens from about 30 seconds till 15 minutes. Now, and the E3 effect is similar. Let me just read you something that happened. Like this is from John Kappenman's paper in IEEE, which is the International Electrical Engineering Forum. And he wrote A Perfect Storm of Planetary Proportions. And he basically said, looking at the big geomagnetic storm in 1989 that wiped out one of these big transformers in Quebec, and it wiped out one of them at a nuclear power plant in the East Coast, and it wiped out one in the UK. And the effect was that the entire province of Quebec was blacked out for like 9 hours, portions of it for 24 or more hours. And there was rolling blackouts up and down the East Coast due to that one at the power plant that went out, and some blackouts in the UK, but none of them were long term. So that's only 3 of these massive transformers that got blown in the northern hemisphere, because this is less than 1/10 as strong as the 1921 storm. But here's what he said about the effect in that storm. He said during the first 30 seconds of the 1989 storm, the Quebec grid experienced 15 simultaneous failures, and the unsurprising result was a province-wide blackout. Now, one of those 15 failures was one of those massive transformers frying. Okay, so this happens. That was the E3 effect that took that transformer down and caused all that. So in the EMP, then you say, okay, well, the government sponsored this EMP commission and said, well, what's really, we don't really understand EMP much, so what's going on? So they have some big labs that do Department of Defense testing on EMP. And here's some real stats. So we'll surprise you because there's a lot of misinformation. Most of us, have heard about the 1 second after book, and we think that immediately every car on the road and every electronic device just stops working. Well, in actual EMP simulations, it turns out that cars are fairly robust because they're, self-contained vehicles. They don't have a bunch of wires going out anywhere. They're not interconnected like the power grid. And they got rubber tires. And sparky things are always happening in cars anyway. So they're kind of hardened to be somewhat protected against electrostatic type of things going on. So about 15% of the cars and trucks driving down the highway will just immediately stop and never work again. And most of the cars that are parked and not turned on at the time will actually survive the EMP. But here's the kicker. Essentially, 100% of all the complex digital control systems, all the computers that are networked with networking wire, dead. All of the industrial control systems that have SCADAs, remote sensing control and data acquisition systems that are digitally controlled, dead. All of the programmable logic controllers that are digitally controlled, that control our factories, that control our sewage and treatment and water treatment facilities, they control our oil refineries, they control our industrial processes, they control our nuclear power plants, dead. 100% failure. Not every component failed, but enough failures that every complex digital control system will fail unless they're specifically protected from EMP. So how big of an area are we talking about? Well, if you look at the Under Chernobyl's article, you'll see a pretty shocking map in there. And that's like say this, that's kind of a worst case scenario. Say Pakistan, which is heavily infiltrated with Islamic fundamentalists within the government and the military. So say one of the Pakistani, people with one of those infiltrated people in the military decided to liberate a full-scale nuclear device to do it to the United States. And they got it on a missile capable of delivering that device. You're talking about like a 1,500-mile circle. You're talking about a circle. Draw a big circle on the map that goes through Quebec City, Ontario, in Quebec. And it goes through like beyond Ottawa, all the way to Winnipeg, in the middle of the plains in Canada. around Chicago, the entire East Coast, all the way down to Miami, Florida, and through Dallas, Texas. So that circle encompasses about 3/4 of the population of the United States, and encompasses about 90% of the nuclear power plants in the United States, and all of the entire East Coast industrial and highly populated corridor. So in that area, now will your iPhone fry? Probably not, unless it's plugged in and charging at the time. Will your portable radio fry? Probably not. Will your car fry? Well, only a 15% chance your car will fry. Will your gas stations fry? Yeah. Those pumps aren't going to work. Will everything that our life depends on fry? Yeah. Will your solar systems fry? Probably. Your panels may not fry, but your inverter, the chips on your inverter may, the control chips, the big power chips on your inverter will probably be okay, but the little microcontroller chips that make everything work on your inverters, they're probably going to cook, unless you have backup things protected in a double. If you want to do, if you want to really make sure you're protected, then you get some of your backup critical stuff, not necessarily your panels. Maybe a panel protected. You wrap them in aluminum foil and you store them somewhere. And maybe you wrap an extra inverter. Your battery's going to be fine. Don't worry about that. But you want to wrap up some extra inverters, and you want to protect some stuff, critical stuff, maybe a ham radio and some extra power inverters, and maybe a computer, a laptop, something that you might want to be able to use afterwards to access digitally stored stuff. You wrap those in foil, and then you store them in like a garbage can, in a metal galvanized garbage can, and that's called a double Faraday cage. And that'll provide about as good a protection as you can get, unless you're a super electronic tech and you download the military paper on grounding and bonding to protect from EMP. In which case, then you can do a better job than the double Faraday cage. Okay.
All very useful information. Oh, me neither on you, but all very important information for all of us to think about. So, maybe people should be thinking about an extra inverter since they have gotten a lot cheaper. Someone could pay attention for the Harbor Freight discounts, use the coupon, shield it, bury it. But I could see a lot of value in having a computer, a camera, a solar panel, inverter, all those things that somebody really might need to document, what's going on after the collapse or the power outage, however long it might last.
Yeah, I mean things like an electronic colloidal silver generator. Just think of the most critical things like ham radio, a hand crank ham radio, maybe a little portable generator, because in 1961, they talk about how you all want to have like pre-microelectronic gadgets that they'll survive an EMP, but yes and no. True that microelectronics is far more susceptible to an EMP than pre-microelectronics. But let me tell you about what Russia found in their EMP test. See, we did our EMP test at Johnston Island in the South Pacific in 1960-61, Starfish Prime. And when they blew off the nuclear bomb, so many kilometers above Johnston Island, the Nobel Prize-winning physicist who'd done the calculations, scientists aren't perfect. I mean, hell, he was the smartest guy in the world at the time, but he still didn't really get it right. He was off by about a factor of 10 to 1 because he didn't really understand the phenomenon of an EMP pulse. So all of their instruments were totally decked out. It's like having a speedometer on your car that goes up to 20 miles an hour, and you're driving 200 miles an hour down the road. You got no idea how fast you're going because you decked out your speedometer when you were just getting warmed up. So that's kind of what happened. So they did all their calculations based on instruments in Honolulu, like 900 miles away. And it knocked out about 20 streetlights in Honolulu, and it knocked out, about 50 cars wouldn't start, and a telephone switching station on Kauai fried. And that's like 900 miles away from Johnston Island. That's a long ways away, and it knocked that out. But in the Soviet Union, they did their EMP test over a remote part of Kazakhstan. Now, what they didn't know was that the interaction of EMP and the Earth's magnetic field is much stronger the further north you go. So the Kazakhstan test had an EMP pulse of 4 times the magnitude of the Johnston Island test not because it was a bigger bomb, not because it was anything in the nuclear end was different. It was simply because they were that much closer to the pole that the effect was so much greater. And so in Kazakhstan, what happened was they had all of these diesel generators, and these are pre-microelectronics generators. These are the things that are supposed to survive and be just fine in an EMP. And they had these things sitting there, ready to go, because they figured it was going to take the grid down. Well, here's what happened. They did the EMP, and the EMP induced a current so strong in a trunk line that was 1,000 kilometers long. That's a 600-mile-long trunk line that fed power to this remote place in Kazakhstan from a power generating station 600 miles away. And this line was buried 2 meters underground. You think that stuff buried underground is going to be okay. But this line's buried 2 meters underground, and it induced enough power in that it burned the power plant down 600 miles away. In other words, this surge went along this line, buried 2 meters underground, and it burned the power plant down 600 miles away. Not only that, it fried most of those backup diesel generators that are supposed to be pre-microelectronics and robust. It cooked them. So the EMP tests are saying 15% of your cars fail, but those robust diesel generators, pre-microelectronics, they mostly all fail. So I don't know. It's like your guess is as good as mine. I mean, I guess when the EMP happens, we'll really find out. So, there's the old Yankee saying that says, hope for the best but plan for the worst. I hope this never happens. I hope an EMP never gets through. I hope a major solar storm never happens. But I can guarantee you the major solar storm is going to happen. And my hope is that either people listening to shows like this will wake up and shake up our congressmen, and they'll put the few $1 billion, a tiny fraction of what they bailed Wall Street out, and fix this problem so Armageddon doesn't happen when the inevitable storm hits, or a smaller storm hits, like what hit South Africa, and it fries enough of these transformers that it's not Armageddon time, but everything's messed up pretty bad in the United States for a long time and makes enough of a stink that we fix the problem before the really big one nails us. So, it's like, who knows? I mean, it's a gamble. Right now it's not looking too good. Right now it's looking like, see, what happened was the new FERC is the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission. These are the government guys in charge of regulating this stuff. And NERC is the National Electric Reliability Corporation. Sounds like a bunch of guys who are out there to, cover our behinds and make sure everything's good. And they want the grid to work well. But everything's been privatized now. It's all for profit. So things are operating, the grid is operating with minimal extra slack, minimal extra capacity, because that's all less profit gone, wasted dollars. So what happens is NERC gets together with Homeland Security, and they sponsor this symposium. And they wrote a report called the HILF Report, High Impact, Low Frequency. And they pointed the finger at both nuclear EMP and solar storms as being the two black swan events that could really, really screw up the country and collapse the country and end life as we know it, and millions of people starve and all that stuff. And people got kind of upset about that. So what does NERC do? Well, then the government says, okay, well, we're going to sponsor the SHIELD Act in Congress. And the SHIELD Act says that the private industry has to pony up the $2 billion to fix the grid and protect us and harden us from EMP and solar storms. So what does NERC do? NERC says, well, wait a minute, that's $2 billion out of our pocket. Where are we going to come up with that kind of money? So what they do is they fire the guys that wrote the HILF report, and they come up with a new report, and they present it to Congress, and they say, don't worry, everything's okay. Turns out that we got enough safeguards in place that, everything's okay, that we can handle it, and don't worry, and you can sleep at night, and everything's good. And Congress says, wow, that's wonderful. That's really terrific. What new studies did you do to negate the Meditech studies that were sponsored by the Homeland Security and Oak Ridge National Labs? And they said, well, we didn't do any new studies. They go, well, what? Well, what did you do? Well, we looked at it, and, what about the Meditech data? Well, we don't have access to the computer codes. So, we really can't study it. But we talked amongst ourselves, and we decided we got it covered. Oh, that makes me feel better. So then what they did was they wrote this bogus report. We'll finish this after the break.
Yes, we will. We'll be back right after this. You're listening to Outside the Box on American Freedom Radio. Today's guest, Matthew Stein, Make sure to bookmark his website. One more thing to add to this conversation. The government has launched several satellites into space to study the sun. Yet, at the same time, from what we're hearing from Matthew, they still haven't put forth several $billion to reinforce the grid. So that's interesting. So they haven't reinforced the grid, but they're spending lots of money to continue to study the sun. And from Michio Kaku and so many others, many people have gotten the warning for many years now. Now this is no longer a new topic, a new revelation. Now we've been talking about this for several years now. Back to Matthew.
Okay, so back to the government and why they're not doing more is what happened then was, NERC basically said, wait a minute, we don't want to spend the $2 billion out of our private industry's pocket. So they came back and said, don't worry, everything's covered, even though they had no research to prove that. So then what happened was FERC, the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, asked NERC to write a standard for what to do in the event of an EMP or solar storm. So NERC, the private industry guys, wrote this feel-good, do-nothing paper, which basically is a protocol that says in the event of a solar storm, this is what you have to do to protect our grid. Only the reality is that, like I'd mentioned earlier, in the first 30 seconds, or 60 seconds, let me see what it said. In the first 30 seconds of the 1989 storm, there was 15 simultaneous failures in the Quebec grid. And that was a tiny, 10% the size storm of the 1921. The one that they're really worried about was, the big ones. And so the chances of this paper protocol being pulled out and doing the right thing in that situation is about zero. So essentially what they did was they wrote this paper protocol so that everyone could be off the hook liability-wise, and they could say, well, we implemented the protocol. We did what the protocol said, and, gee, I'm sorry the grid melted down, and I'm sorry that a bunch of nuclear power plants failed as a result of the long-term power failure and running out of power and running out of backup fuel. But, gee, we just didn't know any better, and and we really can't be blamed for all of this. But to be honest with you, at that point in time, finger-pointing isn't going to do anybody a lot of good, is it? So what do we do as individuals? Well, on the one thing, you can say you do your best to protect yourself and your family. You do your best to be ready for a long-term grid down situation, for a life basically after massive grid failure. And if you live someplace downwind of a nuclear power plant, you have a backup plan, and you hope you never have to implement it, for first driving and then getting out on your bicycles and trailers and getting yourself upwind of these power plants. Because if you go out one day and you look up in the sky and you see the most amazing light show you've never ever seen before your entire life, blood red, green, orange, gold streaks, shimmering curtains all over the sky, and the lights are out everywhere. So you have an unobstructed view of the nighttime sky with big, massive cities and absolutely no lights anywhere. And the lights stay out for a day and another day and another day and another day. Watch that clock and know that in between 1 week and 30 days, nuclear power plants are going to start melting down across America. And you want to get out of there. Now, one of the things they mentioned in the break time on an advertisement is modophyllin. And modophyllin is a seaweed kelp extract that was developed in the Soviet Union post-Chernobyl to help people chelate the heavy metals out of their body and to recover from radiation poisoning. So this is something that's really, truly valuable nutrient. It's not just bogus. It's for real. And I actually take modophyllin every day. And if you're stocking up on stuff, it doesn't hurt to stock up a few cases of modophyllin along with your food. And because if the world's, hopefully it won't happen. But until they protect the nuclear power plants, chances are at least a few of them are going to go up. And in an EMP, it's going to happen. I mean, if we have an EMP attack, a bunch of nukes are going to go Fukushima style almost instantaneously. And it's cumulative. The longer you're downwind, the worse it is. So it's like, so if you are armed with the knowledge, and I go into this in great detail in my book, When Disaster Strikes. I have a chapter on EMP and solar storms, prepping and survival strategies, and a chapter on the unthinkable, surviving a nuclear catastrophe. And unfortunately, they're probably going to both go off at the same time. They're going to be hand in hand. In the solar storm, there'll be some lag. In the EMP, there's going to be no lag. And because it's cumulative, time is of the essence. Getting yourself upwind is going to be of the essence. And if you're on the East Coast, you got a long ways to go. If you're on the West Coast, it's not as bad. And there's very few nuclear power plants in the western states, almost none. In fact, in California now, there's just a couple left. And there's only like a half dozen west of the Mississippi, I think. So it's, but the East Coast, most of those 104 are in the East Coast. So you're going to have to get out of Dodge if that happens, and I hope that day never happens.
So the best places to be are West Coast or middle of the country.
Yeah, but don't think, if you want to, let me see what the map shows. I just had that map up.
But yes, you did share this graphic with me, and people can Google and find this online, a map of where all the power plants are in the U.S., and people can look and see how far one is from where they live.
Yeah, certainly the West Coast, and you can look at them all over the world too. But certainly, yeah, the U.S. nuclear reactors. Basically, if you take a line from the panhandle of Texas northward, almost all of them are east of that line. There's one in central and eastern Texas, and there's in Kansas and Nebraska, on eastern Kansas and eastern Nebraska. And other than that, there's one in Arizona and a couple in south and central California and one up in Washington State. That's Hanford, which I believe is more of a nuclear processing facility than a nuclear power plant. I don't think it's a nuclear power plant. I think it's just Hanford, which is, by the way, killing the Columbia River. That's an unpleasant little fact that leaking. Hanford is leaking badly and killing the Columbia River. But, it's only a river and a bunch of fish. Who cares, right?
We're also overdue for the next big earthquake. So when that happens, Hanford is going to experience a disruption, from what I've heard others say.
Oh, that's true. You've got, the Cascades, you're on the Pacific Rim of Fire, and certainly in the central United States, what's the name of that really big fault line over there and, around, Texas, Tennessee, Kentucky, right, Missouri, right around that line there, the giants.
Madrid.
The Madrid fault, there's a number of nuclear power plants not too far from the Madrid fault. So, yeah, you could have a scenario there, anytime. All it takes is one big move of the Earth. Last one there happened around like 1860 or so, and that was the largest earthquake on record in the United States was New Madrid fault, not a California fault, but
so
New
a
Madrid.
Lot of people are wanting to get prepared for the future, and some people are looking at it from a climate change perspective. And really, someone could look at a variety of really important issues at the same time and then make the best decision where to migrate to or go off-grid from there. That's my assumption. So they can look at the climate change forecast, which is drought in certain areas.
It's tough because the climate change is basically saying that we're screwed out here in the western states because of extreme drought. And, I'd say, from the point of view, I'm in the high Sierras. I'm fairly a ways away from any major metro areas, but, it's not the best place to grow food. Places like southern Canada, Montana, Idaho, a lot of people are talking about as being better with climate change as far as the major zones of precipitation on the west shifting far to the north and leaving extreme drought in California and even in Oregon. Right now the snowpack in the Cascades is horrible, as it is in California. And so, this is where one of the things I teach in my books is the pit of the stomach exercise, where it's an exercise to intuitively test different decisions and options. Because when you know what starts hitting the fan, you won't have CNN and the Weather Channel and things to help you make good decisions. And so that's where your inner spiritual intuitive self can see around the corners and can help you make an accurate decision, whereas your rational mind that won't have enough information at hand. I mean, there's so many possible scenarios between, climate change and destruction of the oceans and potential EMPs or solar storms, and the long-term effects. Even though we've got fracking sort of temporarily helping us out with the peak oil situation, the fracking is a very short-term Band-Aid situation where the fracked wells fail really fast, and most of the best sweet spots have already been drilled. So they're talking peak fracking happening in about 3 years from now. No matter how hard they drill, it's just going to, it'll help for a while, and it has helped now, but it's not a long-term solution. So there's a whole multitude of issues facing our planet, and that's where that intuitive spiritual self can really guide you as to what is your part in the world and where should you be and what level of preparedness should you have. And no one can really tell you that. That's something that your own spirit and your own gut and your own intuition can guide you with. And try to bypass fear, because the intuitive self speaks in a calm voice and it doesn't change its mind. The logical, rational mind will flip-flop a lot based on, fear and the limited information at hand. But then when it's real guidance, it's like totally unwavering and unchanging. It's just calm and it's there, and it doesn't change its mind. It doesn't flip-flop. So that's one test for testing the information, if you're getting good intuitive information, or if it's just your ego speaking to you or your fear speaking through you.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. Sometimes we have to also go out there and just find where we're guided and what the universe opens up for us, like I've been trying to do the last few years and will continue to do from here on out. And if the universe or, my higher power or God, as we could also call it, wants to show me something better than what I've already seen in South Colorado, then I'm open to being shown that. So far, I'm starting to, I'll share this with you briefly, Matthew. I made a few videos while I was out there, and since that time, over 20 people have contacted me. Pretty much enjoying my video series and maybe wanting to hang out sometime if I ever come back to that region. I have never seen people reach out in any part of the earth more than the San Luis Valley of South Central Colorado. I don't know what it is, but the community-oriented attitude is stronger there as far as people reaching out to me than I've experienced anywhere else. And in Portland, it's the absolute worst at this time.
Really? Okay.
Absolute worst. And I would not recommend anyone come anywhere near Portland. I just want to throw this out because we're about to experience extreme population density in ways most people still don't understand. It's not just the UN climate change report that's actually motivated people to come here. There are many homeless that are here for lots of different reasons because it's worse elsewhere. And this attitude of it being worse elsewhere, like L.A., and now Portland being compared every day to L.A. and New York, people in the have and have not category are running here with everything they can carry. It's going through a massive transformation this year. The skyline's quickly changing. Old homes are being destroyed, and compact micro apartments are replacing them. All happening right away right now. Even China is behind the money developing the South Waterfront District, which is the latest news. So just want to make sure people are aware of that might be considering Portland as a haven. It's not a haven. In fact, many locals have been displaced, and I think that people might want to, consider some of the middle country areas, but it's not easy to do by yourself, and we have a drought problem, as you say. And I'm hoping that maybe that problem may be worked out in the future in Colorado and Wyoming, in some of those really dry places. It's too early to tell.
The Anasazi got knocked, out of down in northern New Mexico and southern Colorado. They experienced a long-term drought and plagues that went along with it, and starvation, and it wiped out their civilization. And so there's historically California has been prone to some really long-term droughts. There was a period that was so dry that a forest of trees grew 30 feet or 40 feet below the natural rim of Lake Tahoe, and pretty hefty-sized trees, because it was dry for so long that the water never flowed out of the lake for for 100 years or so, a couple hundred years, and it grew a big forest of trees down below what's now the lake level. So even without man-made climate change, natural sun cycles and natural cycles due to volcanic eruptions, and I had the good fortune before he died of cancer to spend an evening sharing some beers and chatting with Steve Schneider, who was the Stanford scientist who was the chief author of the IPCC papers on climate change. And one of the things I asked him was, people poo-pooed him and said, that's Schneider. He was full of it because he predicted an ice age was coming, then he predicted, that global warming was happening, and so he's just like going after the money, and he just, boy, I tell you, you say something like that to a guy like that, he gets pretty animated in a hurry. So he said, science, it's not a perfect science. So he said back in the 70s, they were looking at the cooling effects of all of the pollution, the aerosol pollutions that man was pumping from industry, pumping into the climate.
We'll pick it up on the other side with our guest, Matthew Stein of Wintech Fails. Final segment up ahead. This is Outside the Box on AmericanFreedomRadio.com. Matthew Stein is our guest from the website WinTechFails.com. I certainly recommend checking out his books, When Technology Fails and When Disaster Strikes, to get a full understanding of his work and his suggestions. I also conducted an interview with him about a year ago, which will be online soon, that gets more in-depth. In a way, it really picks off where we're leaving off today. So with that, we have about 11 minutes left. Matthew, where should we conclude? What other points do we need to bring up?
Well, let's talk about strategic partnerships a little bit. And see, a lot of us, me included, need to make a living. And some of us are better at making a living than others, and others may be better at working the land. And so what a lot of people are doing is working together, partnering for life, what they call, my friend Dr. Richard Allen Miller calls lifeboats. So basically it's a strategic partnership where someone, a friend and family, or just a business partner, is on land somewhere where, it's a good place to grow food, and you have some things set up there, some stores, some supplies, but maybe not a very good place to make a living. And then you have somebody else who's living more closer to urban areas where it's easier to make a decent living. And so the partnership is kind of a you scratch my back, I scratch yours, and, maybe like in my case, my son is in Oregon, in a good place to grow, but not a very good place to make a good living. So we have somewhat of a partnership where I've helped him out, helped install solar panels, get things going, a little cash here and there to help him out. And if push comes to shove and I'm able to get there, then I have a place to go. And so, it's something to think about, and that's also where your intuition comes in. Developing that intuitive inner self, that inner guide, that pit of the stomach exercise, where you, at some point, you may say, I've really got to get out of my urban area where I am. I mean, I'm not in an urban area, but say you are in an urban area. You might say, the writing is on the wall, or my intuitive alarms are going off, and I've got to get out of Dodge. Now, so what's the worst thing that's going to happen? Maybe, you have a scare, and you think there's a solar storm, and you head out, you bug out. Maybe you miss a few days of work, and everything's fine, and you come back. Big deal. Okay, you had a little trial run, You missed a couple of days of work, you pretended to be sick, whatever, you had a little trial run, you made sure everything was working good. No big deal. But if things really did hit the fan, then you got out before the crowds and mobs are so bad that you couldn't get out. So, nobody knows what's really going to happen and when. And I will tell you that human activity, continuing the way we're doing, is collapsing the natural systems of the planet that keep our stable weather, that provide food, in terms of the ocean, and in terms of a livable climate, and in terms of forests. And we are soiling the nest. If we continue the trends that we're doing all over the planet, it's going to be game over. We just don't know when. I mean, 50% of the biomass of the wildlife of the world has disappeared in the last 40 years. Half the world's animals in the oceans and on land are gone. Not half of them are extinct. Half of the biomass of the wildlife has disappeared from our planet in just 40 years. And 70% of the world's zooplankton disappeared from like the 1970s till now, and over half of that happened in the last 20 years. So we're seeing accelerating degradation of natural systems all over the planet because, and think about, and people say, well, why is this happening? Well, two reasons. One is we're industrializing, and our impact of the industrial nations, one person in the industrial nations has like the same global impact as 10 people in sub-Saharan Africa or in India or in China. I mean, it's 5 to 1 in China and like 10 to 1 in these places in Africa in terms of impact. And on top of that, industrialization and increasing impact, just think of the population change in the planet. I mean, when Jesus walked the earth, there was like 250 million people. It took 1,000 years to double that to 500 million people. It took another 800 years to double it. So there was 1 billion people in the world in the year 1800. And it took another 120 years to double that to 1920 to be 2 billion. And then since, in the last 70 years, we have tripled the world's population in the last 70 years. And think about this last little fact. We reached, in the end of 2011, the planet reached 7 billion people. It's now at 7.3 billion. And in the year 2000, it reached 6 billion. So in just under 12 years, more people were added to the population in a decade than were added from the time Jesus walked the earth till Abraham Lincoln. So think that in your mind. In 10 years, from the year 2000 to 2010, more people were added to the world than between Jesus and Abraham Lincoln. And that was just in the last 10 years. And in 12 years, more people were added to the world than lived on the planet when Abraham Lincoln was born. So, I mean, that's like more people in 12 years were added to the planet than the entire planet's population when Abraham Lincoln was born. And that's, wow. So it's like people who think like, oh, you're a globalist because you're talking about controlling population. It's like, no. When in nature there's a term for it. It's called overshoot and collapse. When the animals overpopulate for one reason or another and eat up all the food, they starve. And it's not pleasant and it's not pretty. And it happens over and over again in nature. And human beings are doing that. And either we're going to take the proactive reins ourselves and do the right thing and prevent us from collapsing everything around us and most of us starving, or we're going to let nature do it for us. And it ain't pretty when nature does it for us. It ain't pretty. But the world doesn't care because the world's going to bounce back when we're gone. Either we're going to get ourselves in check to where we don't ruin this planet entirely and we can live in harmony with the planet, or we're going to just keep going, hell's bells, pedal to the metal, headed for that brick wall, 100 miles an hour down those train tracks, ready for the end of the tracks and that brick wall, and we'll just have a hell of a ride while we're going for that brick wall. And, oh, well, it's like, gee, I'm sorry, the train wreck happened. Yeah, I didn't know that was coming, did I? Anyway, what's it going to be? We'll find out. Tune in. And when's it going to be? I don't know the answer to that. People ask me, why did an MIT engineer write a book like When Technology Fails? And back in the year 1997, I'd had a 20-year practice of prayer and meditation at that point in time. And in my morning session of prayer and meditation, I just simply made a generic request for guidance and inspiration. And I got a bomb dropped in my lap. I received this vision dumped into my head, a pictorial storyboard outlining this massive book project to help people plan for and deal with massive failures in central services and our global technologies. And my first thought was, like, no way, I don't know all this stuff, I can't possibly do this. And the little voice, this, Jesus calls it the still small voice, the little voice of Spirit spoke calmly and clearly in my head, and it said, nobody knows it all. And it assured me I had the skills and talents that if I chose to take the assignment on, and it always felt like an assignment and never felt like my idea, that I'd get the inner and outer help I needed to make it happen. And it took me a year to decide it was a decent idea. Maybe I could do it. Another year to write a proposal and sample chapters and find a small publisher to give me a modest advance. And then the last year I racked up the credit cards, bit the bullet, charged the credit cards up, borrowed on my house, and spent 70 hours a week making the first edition of When Technology Fails happen. And 8 years later, I put another year of my labor and time into a massive update to When Technology Fails. And so I've got 3 years of my life and all the equity in my home. I could have built a beautiful Earthship on 5 acres of land. Instead, it's all in my book. But you people have the benefit. You can go out, and you don't have to put 3 years of your life and all the equity in your home and your savings and your sweat and your time. You can just buy my book. So, it's a lot easier for you than it was for me. And believe me, I didn't get rich off this one. I'm not sad I did it, though sometimes I've regretted it from the financial consequences of doing it. But I'm proud of it, and I felt like I was honest and true to the vision that Spirit dumped into my head on that day at Thanksgiving in 1997. I did my best to take that vision I was shown and put it out on paper. And, it ain't perfect, but nothing is.
So you have only one website, is that correct? WhenTechFails.com?
I have 3 websites. I got WhenTechFails.com, and that's my information-intensive website, and lots of really great books to link to on, recommended books like, foraging for herbs, edible herbs, like really valuable foraging. There's a lot of kind of foraging books that show everything, but not in enough detail to really be valuable. What I like is the books that give you great detail and show you pictures from all seasons of the year, and a couple hundred of very common, very edible foods are much more important than 2,000 foods, most of which you can't identify and are not very edible and pretty unpalatable. So, good stuff.
Good stuff, and I'll add the other 2 websites in the description to this video. Thank you, Matthew, for coming on. I'm Alex Ansary. This has been another edition of Outside the Box Radio. We're looking forward to having William Whitecrow on our show tomorrow, and Eve Lorgan is our guest on Friday. So a lot of interesting guests coming on this show shortly. Thank you so much for tuning in. We'll talk to you all tomorrow.